Good evening, everyone. Welcome to this wonderful talk. I'm so excited to be here tonight. My name is Brandon Wallace. I'm the National Director of Special Education at Urban Teachers. Urban Teachers, of course, is a 4-year teacher preparation program located in Dallas, Washington, D.C., and in the great city of Baltimore, where we are tonight. While we kind of take care of some housekeeping notes, can you all just turn off your cell phones, please? Those of them who are here in the audience with me, I'd really appreciate that. Thank you so much. Now, we have a lot to get to today with an amazing guest speaker, guest lecturer. But before I do that, I have got to get some of the thank yous out of the way. I want to thank Terra Cafe for hosting us, of course. Mr. Reese, the owner here, Terrence Dixon, Mr. Ali, thank you for having us. The cafe's fantastic staff. I see radio personality Sheila Cass in the building. I thank you for coming. Our executive director for Baltimore site, Sherelle James, is here. And of course, our amazing CEO and co-founder, Jennifer Green, is in the audience. Can we just give our Urban Teachers family a big round of applause for being here? And with no further ado, I am so pleased to have Dr. Yolanda Abel here with me. She's an amazing mentor, a former teacher of mine, a great friend, and just a wonderful person to know. I'm going to read her bio as quickly as I can and then get into the meat of this conversation. So Dr. Yolanda Abel is an associate professor in teaching and learning at the School of Education and a faculty affiliate with the National Network of Partnership Schools at the Center for Social Organization of Schools at the Johns Hopkins University. Her current research focuses on family and community engagement related to students' 3rd and 5th STEM experiences. She is co-principal investigator on student achievement in Baltimore elementary schools, a grant called the NSF 12-518 MSP Targeted Award. Her most recent publication is co-authored with Drs. Galando and Sanders, and she appears in the centennial edition of the American Educational Research Journal, ARA. Her dissertation, African American Father Involvement and Their Children's School-Based Lives, earned the 2008 Judith Rukin Research Award from the Maryland Association for Supervision and Curriculum Development. Can we give Dr. Abel a round of applause? So good having you here, Dr. Abel.
Thank you. It's a pleasure. Thank you for the invitation. I am very happy to be here tonight with urban teachers and community members who are interested in this topic. It is one that is near and dear to my heart, and I'm looking forward to us having scintillating conversation.
Awesome. We're going to take some questions over Facebook and some audience questions, but before we get to that, I have a million questions no, I'm not going to ask you a million questions. I do have a few questions, and I want us to start with your narrative. So can you talk a little bit about you being raised by a black father, your uncles, things like that, and how did that impact your life?
I am originally from New York City. I moved to Baltimore in the early 90s to teach. I am, or was, early childhood certified and taught 2nd grade. Both of my parents are from small towns in South Carolina. My mother was one of 7 and my father's one of 5. So I had lots of aunts and uncles growing up, grandparents on each side. Great uncles. So I have always known and been surrounded by positive black men who were not only working to do things within their own family units, and I mean that both in the immediate sense as well as the extended sense. I could tell you millions of stories about going down south. My maternal grandfather was a farmer, and I have lots of experiences of being out with him as he did his daily chores. You get up really early on a working farm. So to that extent, I know what it is to be nurtured and cared for and supported by men who think of you as a wonderful person and have a vested interest in helping you turn out to be a productive adult. And I mean that in the most broad sense, that yes, you grow up and you can economically take care of yourself, but you're also kind, you're considerate, you give back, kind of that multifaceted approach. I said that I moved to Baltimore in the early 90s to be a teacher. And at that point in Baltimore City, there was a high teenage pregnancy rate among African American females. And there was kind of this campaign from the child support enforcement side of the quote unquote deadbeat dad. And child support matters. I have a child myself. They can be expensive to rear, but I didn't think that was the message to send out. When I finished teaching in the classroom, I decided that if we really wanted to help children, we needed to help their parents. And in particular, I picked teen parents. And so I started working with teen moms. And so the first question is, well, there's somebody else in this equation. So how can we start bringing fathers into this concept? And I was at a local high school here in Baltimore City that no longer exists. And so we worked on doing some programming. And so kind of thinking again about the men who reared me and helped me to kind of negotiate life and to learn who I am as a person and as a woman, because there are some things that you learn differently from the men in your life than you do from the women in your life. And so those are necessary ingredients. So I like to think that I have had wonderful role models, both in those elder adults, but also among my male cousins as they grew up and started to kind of navigate and negotiate life. My mother has a sister who they were very close to, and she has 2 children, a daughter and a son. But the son, my cousin, he and I are only 3 months apart. So we spend a lot of time together. And trust me, teenage girls and boys think about things quite differently. But we had some wonderfully spirited conversations kind of about what that meant at the time frame where you're trying to figure that out in terms of who you are as a person, who do you want to date, all those kinds of things. So I just think that there is a positive energy that you get from the men in your life that is different than the one you get from the women in your life. And in terms of kind of what was happening again in the early 90s, I just thought the conversation was too one-sided, and we were not talking about all those black men in particular, but fathers in general who were doing the right things, who were involved, who were invested. And on a very personal note for me, we were also not having that conversation greatly about the ways in which women sometimes hinder fathers from being involved and invested. So in the context of fatherhood work that I've been doing for many years at this point, it isn't so much about quote unquote teaching fathers how to be fathers, though I have run fatherhood groups. In the context of me being in education, like I said, I started out as a classroom teacher, and now I work at Hopkins at the School of Education, primarily working with teachers or persons who are working to become teachers, depending on the program and the vantage point. It became about how do we in education view fathers and what's their role in the engagement process. And I think Brandon has some other questions for me that will go more into the answers to that, as well as questions that might come from you and or our Facebook Live audience.
And you beautifully segued into my next question. And so it seems like you have like a litany of positive experiences when it comes to black males in your life. I'm interested in like dispelling the myths. And so what are some of the myths that you've heard kind of purported about black men, black fathers in your work?
Well, first and foremost, that they don't exist, that they're absent and they're missing. And while that is true in some cases, I can't argue against that. Again, there are fathers who are there, whether they are romantically involved with the mother of their children or not. So kind of how do you get that story out? And in that case where parents are learning how to co-parent, while it is not necessarily the job of the school, because schools have enough to do in terms of educating the child, I think it's an issue that schools and teachers and administrators need to be aware of, because how do you send home messages and information? And in the issue of non-custodial parents, that can get additionally complicated because there are legal issues associated with how you share information and kind of who you share information with. But thinking about where your schools are located, what are the community resources that might be of service? There's a mediation nonprofit here in Baltimore City, so is there like a way to maybe connect your school with that? There's a wonderful resource, the Center for Urban Families, Joe Jones runs, and they do both fatherhood workshops as well as co-parenting workshops. Because again, for me, ultimately, no matter what I've done in my education tenure, it's about children and their well-being and wanting them to be well. So first and foremost, that they do exist, that they do care. When I was working on my dissertation, I went to a conference called the National Black Child Development Institute, and I did a session on my preliminary data at that time, and I had a room of about 40 participants, 38 of whom were black males in appearance, because I didn't know them all, and 2 of whom were white women. I go through my spiel, we start talking. One of the gentlemen in the audience, at some point says, "I'm really glad I came to this session. I just knew you were going to bash black men and talk about how we aren't there." No, that's not what I'm about. I actually want to tell the opposite of that story. Let's acknowledge those who are. And then that can get complicated, because why do you acknowledge someone for doing what they should be doing? And it isn't that, it's just making a broader narrative. So, and then for those of us who might be learning, because parenting is the one job that nothing really prepares you for. Even if you read the books, take the classes.
They don't work? Those books don't work?
Well, I'm not going to say they don't work, but until you actually have to try it out and do it, it's a lot like classroom management. Because there's some lovely classroom management books out there. But the theory and the practice, and depending on how many children you have, what worked for one might not work for the other.
Yeah.
So definitely that they're not there, that they're not involved. And then I think the other one, and again, kind of my framework of where I'm coming out of in the 90s and child support enforcement, that fathers are the breadwinners, and if they can't contribute money, they don't need to be there. We get so much more from fathers. It isn't just about the economics. And again, I recognize children cost money. I'm not going to argue against that. But just the spending time, the talking, the asking of questions, whatever that father's gifts and talents might be in terms of sharing them. I'm not going to lie to you, I can't fix a car to save my life, but my father liked to work on cars. So did I spend time with him while he did that? And he talked about it and attempted to tell me some stuff? It didn't stick, just not my interest. So again, it's that quality, that interaction, just how do you make that work? And I think the other contentious area around the myths is that it's all about moms. Again, I've had very good friends, like I said earlier, who became fathers in their late teens, and they had legal custodial agreements, because in some states, Maryland being one of them, if two unmarried persons have a child, legally speaking, neither of them has custody until you go to court and have it declared by the court. So in terms of one, he was going through a really hard time. He paid his child support. He adhered to his visitation schedule. He participated in under the terms of his agreement. Well, at some point, the mother of his child met a new man. And ultimately, they were going to get married. And she basically told my friend she didn't want him to come around anymore. She wanted him to still pay his child support, but she didn't want him to come and spend time with their child. And, you know, he was bummed and angry and a whole bunch of other things that I'm not going to say right now. But we spent a lot of time talking about his legal rights, because in their case, they did have a custody agreement, it's a legal document, and how she was in violation of that agreement. And I encouraged him to take her to court, which he did, and ultimately won, because she couldn't violate the custody agreement solely because she was now getting married and wanting her husband to have that sole kind of father role in the life of their child. And then last but not least, kind of the gatekeeping role that can happen sometimes among women unintentionally. I'm going to give us the benefit of the doubt. Many years ago, I worked on a research project called the 3-Generation Research Project. It was out of University of Maryland School of Medicine and Johns Hopkins Public Health before it was named for Bloomberg. It was just public health. But anyway, we were looking at African-American first-time teen moms here in the city. We recruited directly out of hospitals. We not only interviewed them, we interviewed the fathers of the children and the maternal grandmas, because at this point they were teenagers and for the most part living at home with their mothers. And so kind of talking about the issues and the concerns, and depending on who mom was and what relationship she might have had with her significant other and the father of her children, some of that messaging she inadvertently passed on to her daughter, which then influenced the way in which the daughter was approaching the father of her child. So kind of taking a step back and recognizing that while your relationship, for whatever reason, might not have worked out, in terms of maternal grandmas in particular, but women in general, to still give the benefit of the doubt and to be open to other ways. And that kind of ties back into the, if you can't give me any money, you know, buy me some Pampers, some formula, I don't want/need you around. And that isn't true. Fathers give so much more than just kind of just the money. So I think in terms of the recap, that fathers are around, black fathers, that it isn't just about being an economic breadwinner, and that women, moms in some cases, need to be more open and reflective of the ways in which we work with the father of our children to best support.
Now, you gave a really rich narrative, and notwithstanding like the legal battles that happen in the lives of these parents, I'm curious to find out, and I love how you allowed that space to say like schools can't do everything. But what can teachers and principals and schools do to facilitate better, rich relationships for fathers, specifically black fathers?
There's an organization based here in Maryland called the National Fatherhood Initiative. I do have some half sheets as a resource sheet to give out at the end of tonight, so the email link is on that. When I was active still in the fatherhood work, they are, and still are, a rich resource of materials. So first and foremost, what type of chairs do you have in your seats? Because if you are teaching younger children, you usually have smaller seats. And we as women don't always like to sit on them, but physically in most cases, men are usually bigger than us. So is there a seat that they are comfortable in? When they walk in the school building, what do they see? I do have a child. She's now 23. She's a graduate of city schools. And I can tell you that sometimes when I walked in the office, I didn't necessarily feel welcomed and wanted in the school building. So again, thinking about who we are as people, and if we're going to be honest, sometimes how we let our personal issues kind of stem into our workflow. What's the greeting? What's the presence? If there is art wall on the walls, and I'm pointing to what we have here in Terra Cafe, which is quite nice, how much of it depicts fathers and children interacting and moving? There's an issue that I have yet to figure out. So like I said, I spent some time doing fatherhood conferences, lots of different places, schools, national conferences. And one thing that men tell me quite often is that when schools send home notes that say, "Dear parents," they don't believe it's for them. They see that as code for mom, that they're not really who the school rather is targeting and wanting to talk to. Now, that gets complicated the more children you have, because it's like, I don't know if they can genuinely take the time to write, "Dear Mr. and Mrs. So-and-so," and whatever the case might be, but kind of working on that connection for how do you reach out and respond. And now this is going to sound very stereotypical, but what color paper do you send your notes home on? Do you pick colors that are more traditionally female-oriented? And again, I said this was going to be stereotypical. Or do you pick those that are more male-oriented? It does matter in regards to how serious they take a note. And I've had men tell me this in countless different settings and places, both one-on-one interviews and small group conference presentations and whatnot. When you are organizing an event and want something to happen, again, speaking in generalities, females tend to be collegial, and we want to talk and chat and catch up. Men, for the most part, want to come in, they want to hit their agenda, they want to accomplish their goal and go. So when you're planning meetings and events, to kind of keep that in mind in regards to making them feel welcomed and wanted and that they have something to contribute. Two of the things that resonate with me most from my time being more intimately involved in fatherhood work than I currently am, though I'm actually conducting father interviews right now, but that's a different conversation too. Fathers say they aren't asked. Because we make that assumption that they're not around and they're not invested, we don't ask. B, we make the assumption to bypass them. Fathers have told me that they are the first person on the emergency contact, that when they've met with the teacher, they say, "Contact me first, not my wife, my girlfriend, my significant others," and teacher still contacts the mom. So part of it is just being, again, consciously aware of how you're reaching out and making that connection and not to assume. Can every parent show up at school? No, they can't. But it doesn't mean that you don't ask, that you don't offer the opportunity. And then you make it in such a way that they feel valued and welcomed when they do walk in the door.
I think that's so important, especially because there's differences, and we have to recognize the differences. So in as much as those are differences, are there any similarities? I just think specifically to like the role of parent involvement in like the historical analysis of schools. And so when, like you just called mom, right? Like you always called mom, you always send. So how did you kind of like break that misnomer or that bad habit, or I don't want to say bad habit, but how do you like kind of combat like what history has suggested that we do?
Very conscious thought, being aware of it. Again, I was an early childhood certified teacher and I taught the younger grades. So when you're making invitations and you're sending things out, how do you make sure you are specifically inviting fathers? If mom or grandmom is the person who actually comes to pick up said student, how do you say, we're having so-and-so and such and such? Is there some special male in Yolanda's life that might want to come and be invited? Because I'm also sensitive to the fact that it might not be mom and dad, it might be older brother, it might be uncle, it might be granddad, mom's new boyfriend. So kind of how do you just help to identify it's that male in that child's life who is there, who's making a significant impact, who's spending time with him, even if it isn't that quote unquote biological role that we first think of when we hear the word dad. And then some of it is listening to what your parents will tell you, in so much that if they say call dad first, call dad first. Think about who you bring into your classroom, both in terms of role models and just language. Related but not, LGBT and language has become a much more issue versus when I was in the classroom in the 90s. So when I teach my parent involvement class, the other thing I encourage at this point is parent one and parent two versus mom and dad, because it could just as easily be dad and mom and mom. So if it's parent one and parent two, it goes from there. And children, as they get older, can be in complicated experiences like group homes. So again, who might be the counselor or the individual that has really connected and resonated with that student? And how do we make some concerted effort to reach out and invite them for what they can? Again, legal issues, you might not be able to share certain information, but if there's some kind of programming, if students are doing a presentation, there are ways to come physically present in the building. And then utilize your relationships. One of my favorite stories, I was at a conference doing a presentation, fatherhood related, and a gentleman in the audience shared, black man, that he was currently PTA president. And this was probably 15 or so years ago. I'm feeling old. But anyway, I said to him, if you don't mind, I haven't met many men who have told me they're PTA president. Tell me a little bit about your journey and how you got there. And he was like, well, when my son was in upper elementary, I was at a game, so sports, and I was talking to other parents and complaining. And they were like, well, you shouldn't just complain. Come join the PTA. So he joined. And as his child went through school, he continued to join, ultimately by the time this child was in high school, becoming PTA president. But in so much that it started because A, he was at something stereotypical, sports, and B, another parent suggested. So again, who's already in your building?
Yeah.
Who do they connect and talk to? Utilize your resources to kind of share, get the word out, and make the request. While you might start out with something that is kind of a gender stereotype, if you will, the goal is just not to stay there, to kind of to get to know them and what it is they do, their interests, their talents, how they can share. I had an opportunity to talk with one of the local child care centers in Baltimore City recently, and one of them did a fatherhood session on girls' hair. So they had a session to help fathers better understand how they could braid primarily their daughter's hair. So kind of, think about who your population is. How can you connect? Who do you personally know? What are their talents? And then you just build from there. The other piece of advice I think I would give is start small. Sometimes we can be very disillusioned as teachers when we plan something and quote unquote no one shows up or two people show up. Depending on where your school is and what the history of that community is, that's okay. How do you then make the plan the next year to kind of double or triple, depending on what the circumstance might be? I can tell you that one of my greatest pet peeves when my daughter was still a student in city schools were things that were here today and gone tomorrow. So there does need to be some consistency, some longevity. I teach a partnership class now at Hopkins, and my goal isn't to force everyone to be a classroom teacher. I'm no longer a classroom teacher, so you might not stay. But my question is, how do you help institutionalize that program in your setting? How do you look at succession planning? How do you help that it stays, that it's an anchor, so that the parents, because most of us in the city have more than one child, they'll go to the same school. If it was a really good thing that my oldest got to go to, I probably want my youngest to go to too, as opposed to it no longer exists because the teacher or teachers who might have spearheaded it aren't there anymore. So that would be what I'd say.
What's a quick win for teachers? So when you say like start off small, I'm thinking like, I've heard like daddy donut daughter things and like little activities like that. Do you start that small? Is it just a parent conference that you bring a dad into?
I think it's even smaller than that.
Okay.
And it's that initial communication. How do you just reach out and say hi and find out who is important in this child's life? And then just making some communication. While you might not necessarily be able to share grades, I am a fan of the newsletter. Yes, I know that's work, but how do you share what's going on? How do you give encouragement for things that parents can do at home in support of children's learning, the extension? So I think it's just that initial, you are welcomed. Depending on how much bulletin board space you have in and around your classroom, my principal required me to change my bulletin boards for every curricular unit. What might be the space that kind of profiles dads moms, or if you know your population, parent 1, parent 2. It has been my experience, both through my research and through just kind of interactions I've had with persons I know and kind of casual people you meet here and there at conferences that you don't necessarily keep in touch with. Men really do like to be asked. So kind of how, again, are you setting that stage that makes them feel welcome, appreciated, and wanted? As an aside, but related, Brandon mentioned my dissertation. It was about African American father involvement in children's school-based lives. And notice I said school-based lives, I didn't say school. One of the reasons, if I think I was to ask each of you to tell me how your parents were involved, if they were, you could answer that. Those of you who have children, if I were then to ask you how you're involved, it would most likely mirror the ways in which your parents were involved. Those of you who don't have children might not have really thought about it yet. And because we as humans don't tend to think about it and do what we have seen and experienced, it most likely will still mirror what your parents did, unless you make some other conscious thought. So having said that, I was raised in a 2-parent household. Both my parents worked. They did not necessarily come to school for report card nights, back to school nights. They showed up for graduations and things of that nature. But I love school. In 12 years, I missed a day and a half. And they were both in senior year by my choice because of other things that were going on.
I want to know, what were you doing on those? You're not going to disclose that today.
One of the really good girls in my clique, my circle, her sister died.
Oh,
and we
I'm
all
sorry to
took
hear
the day
that.
off to go to her funeral.
Okay.
The other, at one time, I was a dancer. And my dance troupe was performing in a home for the elderly. I took half a day off to do that.
All right. Those are excused. Those are, I think those are excused actions.
When I say I love school,
You
I
love
really mean
school.
I love school. So for me, the answer isn't necessarily that parents have to go to school, though I get why we as teachers want it. I am much more inclined, what are those things that parents are doing at home in the community that are in support of a child doing well in school? So kind of how do you help send that message? And so even if you are asking and making suggestions, that's one of the reasons why, like I said, I like the newsletter or the curriculum letter that goes home. We're working on this with things that parents can kind of do at home, if you will, that are in support of what is going on in classroom learning. But getting back to the dissertation, kind of where the story is going, one of the predictors of whether or not a black male will be an involved parent, if and when he becomes a parent, is whether or not he felt like he had a teacher who cared when he himself was in school. And without necessarily getting into all the stats kind of around black male achievement, and if you really are interested, the Schott Foundation puts out excellent work around black male achievement. So kind of what you're doing now to give you even more pressure isn't even just about this child succeeding well emotionally in your classroom, academically, but it also has some impact on his involvement later on in life if he becomes a parent. Now, there are other mitigating factors in there, such as his ultimate level of education. But again, if he does better in school, high school degree or higher, more likely, has to do with the relationship with his mom. Again, if they can stay together, more likely. So there are other things that matter, but being that I am in teacher prep, or have been for most of my career post early childhood teaching, the fact that what teachers do can have such a great influence has really resonated with me. And I think that's why I structure my classes the way I do, in terms of how can we make it a welcoming and wanted environment, and to be more expansive. And I'm giving a really long answer to your question. So Brandon said earlier that I'm a faculty affiliate with the National Network of Partnership Schools. That is run by a woman, a doctor of education, called Joyce Epstein. She has a framework of parent engagement since the early 90s, actually, and it's kind of stood the test of time, if you will. Things have been modified and changed. At one point, Baltimore City, DC, Montgomery County, I'm thinking of places that I've had teachers over the years, Howard, have all had her framework somehow embedded in their parent and community involvement policies and practices. So basically all she did was look at the literature, if you will, because it is research-based, about the ways in which parents can be involved. So the other thing I like to remind us as teachers and school-based persons is that there's lots of ways for parents to be involved. The first one obviously is parenting. And no, I don't think it's about schools telling parents how to parent per se, but one of the best pieces of information I got came from my daughter's kindergarten teacher. and it was about how much sleep she needed. So kind of, again, what are those things that you just kind of share within your purview that are supportive? Not necessarily, this is how you parent, this is not how you parent. That gets real complicated. Probably the heart of her framework is communicating. And what I like about Epstein's conceptualization, it's two-way. So when you send home notes, is there a space that a parent can write back? My favorite form of communication probably was her third grade teacher, who at back to school time went out and brought notebooks for everybody in the class. Yes, teachers spend their own money on supplies. Been there, done that. And my daughter carried this notebook back and forth. I knew to check it every night to see if there was a note from the teacher. If I wanted to write something on my own volition, I could. The teacher knew to check it. And so just kind of, what's that system? And that it really is a two-way process. I said earlier that I think the very, very first step is just making that kind of initial neutral communication. Yes, I know that some of our children have lots of issues that for a variety of reasons they don't have adequate resources to process, and it manifests itself in behavior that we as teachers do not always like. So one of my favorite techniques I do in class is PQP, praise, question, polish. Say something nice. Ask a question. Tell me a little bit about what's going on. Sometimes there are things. One of my favorite students, testing time of all times, he came to school and went to sleep. They live right next door to school. When it was school day was over, I walked over, and I already had a relationship with mom, so this wasn't out of the blue. And I just kind of like, what's going on? Well, they were up to 2 a.m. moving furniture. So it explains why he comes to school and so, we talk about testing. I know you have things to do. Might it be possible he could go to bed a little earlier tonight? And thankfully, he was, and he came to school the next day. So kind of that two-way piece is really important. The other thing I like about Epstein's conceptualization, volunteering. Again, it isn't necessarily you need to come to school. So what might parents have at home that's not a hardship? So depending on what you're doing, it might be the toilet tissue paper rolls, because maybe you want to make something out of tubes, build a rocket, whatever your curriculum is. So what are ways that I can still give back that A, don't necessarily cost me money, because I've gotten those notes too about how I can't afford to do X, Y, Z. And I don't necessarily need to come to the school building. Probably from a research standpoint, and the one that I am most passionate about is her learning at home. So again, children spend a lot of time at home. What are the ways that parents can naturally have that conversation? If you still cook, how do you talk about having a recipe, doubling a recipe, kind of the natural learning? That's why I said, if you're doing those newsletters, those notes home around curriculum, how can you make those connections for ways that you can? If we're talking about fathers in particular, and lots of men, again, going back to the gender stereotype, are good with their hands. How do you talk about building something? The measurement in that, kind of make those learning connections more explicit. Decision making is kind of around the PTO, the PTA. Every parent is not going to want to have a governance role. Some will. So again, that opportunity, and how do you listen to their voice and let them know that A, your experiences and your opinions count, but B, the reality of kind of the parameters in which we have to work is going to most likely influence this kind of decision. Because again, as a quote unquote educated parent, I hate going places and just having conversation and people go off and do what they want to do. I feel like that was a waste of my time. So parents, no matter what their socioeconomic background, really aren't any different. And then last but not least, collaborating with the community. What are ways that you can help make connections? It was a teacher who first told me about the TWIGS program, which I don't know if it still operates because my child has grown out of the School for the Arts, because she noticed my child had some affinity for coloring and drawing and making things. And so I enrolled her in that, and she went all through elementary school. So while it is not necessarily a teacher or a school's job to kind of know everything that exists in the community, what might be those big things, if you will? And again, how do you help make connections? Because we as parents don't always know. So those are those kind of 6 things. And like I said, I like the broad conceptualization that usually there is some way that you can connect with the parent over something, especially if he happens to be a father.
So you talked about Epstein's framework, and I've been privileged enough to be able to go to your office. You have a lot of books.
Yes, I do.
A lot of books. Give us 1 or 2 must-reads if we're going to really embark upon this work.
That's a really hard question.
I ask hard questions, Yolanda.
That is very unique and individual, I think, to who you are. So the easy answer to that, because I somewhat started this conversation by saying that we as educators needed to reconceptualize how we think about fathers, their view, that their presence, that they're active. So again, the National Fatherhood Initiative, every so often they put out a book called Father Facts. I believe they're up to the 7th edition, maybe the 8th. And what it is a compilation of the importance of fathers. Children who have fathers in their lives are more likely to earn A's, stay in school, have less behavior issues in terms of suspensions and expulsions. So it's not a book in the sense that you were thinking about, but kind of wanting kind of the why we do this and why it's important. I think it's a good place to start, especially if we need some help and some remembrance, if you will, along those lines. Outside of that, I've been thinking about all the things I've kind of read, and the reason why I say I think it is personal, and I'm so going to blank on the title, so I might have to follow up with Brandon later and give it to him. But there's a woman who wrote a fatherhood book, kind of about the perspective of daughters and dads, because also a large part of that conversation in the 90s when I first got involved in fatherhood work was why fathers and sons, and why boys needed fathers, and obviously they do, but so do girls. So kind of telling that story, and so that resonated with me by virtue of being female, and again, kind of what was going on just seemed to not be talking about the girls. So on that level, I can't give you a specific title to read, but there are things that I think will resonate with you based on who you are and kind of where you have been and what's going on in your world, and that would be the best place to start, because when you pick a book that has some personal meaning to you, it is much more likely to stay with you and kind of influence what you do.
And our girls of color really do need that. That Georgetown research study that just came out, that was really big. Push Out. There's a lot of research starting to happen around girls of color. I have totally stolen, I've been like literally into this conversation. I totally forgot we have to ask questions from the, no, it's good. Anyone from the audience would like to ask a question of Dr. Abel? This is your prime time, your absolute chance to do it.
Yeah, so I have a question.
Do we need a mic? Just want to make sure that the folks via Facebook can hear you.
Just pass around next person. Okay.
Awesome.
So I do have a question. You spoke about the communication from the teachers to the parents and things of that sort. So majority of the time, most teachers in Baltimore City are female, and they feel comfortable communicating with females who are parents. So how do you encourage, and as the principal of a school, encourage and motivate teachers to reach out to father figures, you know, in order to communicate and start that initial conversation?
Is there any parent, male parent at this moment, or parents that are active? Because I would say start with them, and it's part of a PD, professional development, okay, or the school family council, some place where you'll have the teachers, especially the key ones that you want. I'm all about your circle of influence.
Yeah.
Remember I said start small? So who are more willing to like try, if you will? And then again, I think that Father Facts is a great book because it gives the reasons why, how it makes a difference. But most of us are more compelled by that personal story. So who are your fathers who are really active? Kind of what inspires them? What do they think will get other men in that building? Kind of that comfort. And then, depending on your relationship with your teachers, kind of that fine line, again, the first thing I said, well, not one of the first things, but what were your parents like? How did they parent? And you don't necessarily even need to have them give back, answers, but to think about it. And how does that influence your practice? What might be a goal I need to set to kind of reach out and do differently? But I think too, what's in your wall? Do you have pictures around the building of fathers and children who are interacting? Kind of what's the overall message that the school is sending about the importance of fathers and how they are wanted and welcomed in the building? So start small, circle of influence. Some of the information about why it's important to have fathers involved, and some connection back to the how and why they were parented. And I don't know your staff. I've taught all kinds of classes, and I said I've done all kinds of fatherhood groups. Some issues can be traumatic. I don't know people's stories. And so it also might be helpful to just say, this resource exists, or remember that you have this type of clinical service through your insurance or whatever, because depending upon what my personal story is, that can be quite painful as well. So in terms of, while it's not necessarily quote unquote your business as principal or the administrator of the building, I think you do need to recognize the mental health and well-being of your staff when you're asking them to do something that might be uncomfortable for them.
Yeah, thanks so much. I'm going to encourage those of them who are on Facebook to start typing out your questions. I know we're going to have a lot coming our way. Anyone else in the audience, face-to-face audience, like to ask a question from Dr. Abel?
Thank you, Dr. Abel. It is? Okay, great. All right, so you talked about the different ways that we can bring fathers into the school. Do teachers and school leaders have a responsibility to be out in the community as well so that fathers see their presence and feel more comfortable then coming into the school? And what does that look like? What could that look like?
Relationships matter, whether you're a community school or a more traditional school or a charter school. So again, it's about getting to know your families. Where might they have their Pee Wee League games at? Where might be a large concentration of your students and their families attending faith-based services? And I think as you build one-on-one relationships, who might invite you to their church or to their family event? Obviously, you have your own family in some cases and you find that balance, but it's making that connection so they can get to know you. I also think that if I was to ask each of you why you would do something, a lot of it would go back to who asked you to do it and the relationship you have with that person. So that's no different from your families. When the gentleman over here, I said start kind of, are their fathers already active in your building? Kind of where do you go so they can see you and make that presence known?
I'm going to ask a real quick question from Facebook Live. It says there's a shortage of black male teachers in Baltimore City, where schools have about 80% black children. What is the role of a black male teacher if there isn't a father at home, or if there is one, how to fortify that relationship to make sure that the black male teacher is one of like quality or substance?
I'm not certain I got the last part of that, because you started with the father in the home, the black male teacher, substance. Kind of how do they work together?
Yeah, let's deal with the first. Let's deal with the first part. So, what is the role of a black male teacher in Baltimore City schools, especially because of the shortage?
First and foremost, obviously, to be an excellent teacher. The next gets complicated. I think by virtue of the fact that you are present, you are a role model. The way in which you dress, the way in which you interact with the students, the way in which they see you interact with the staff, especially the female staff, all of that sends a message whether you intended to or not. Now, do you kind of go that quote-unquote extra step? To me, that's a very cautionary response, in that teaching is a hard job. So there is some parameters I think you take into consideration, and I'm going to use a story from my own life. When my child was between the ages of 2 and 5, I mentored a teen mom here in Baltimore City. She was 15 when I met her. She just had her child. She was still in school. Those of you who remember Paquin, she went there back in the day. And I am a single parent myself, so my child would go with me when I went to visit her, so on and so forth. Let's fast forward 3 years, high school graduate, her daughter's on her way to kindergarten. My daughter's on her way to kindergarten too. I enjoyed this young woman. We had a wonderful mentoring relationship, in my opinion, and I think she would say so too. But as the program I was affiliated with wanted to give me a new mentee, I actually said no. And I said no because as my child was transitioning into a more traditional school setting and environment, I felt like I needed to give my quote-unquote extra energy to her. Otherwise, later on, somebody would want to be mentoring her. So I think you need to look at your life circumstances, where you are, and all those kinds of things before you kind of blanketly say you're going to mentor every black male child in your school. Having said that, we are human. Are there particular children that we might be more fond of than others? Yes. They are, let's be honest. So kind of what's that balance? Is it just a little extra word? Is it taking aside to kind of find out what's going on? Some encouragement? It could be as innocuous as there was a boy in 2nd grade who was getting into fights like you wouldn't believe. And you know, the standard behavior, give stars, take stars away. None of that really mattered to this little boy getting into fights. Well, there was another teacher in the building who had been there for many years, in the sense that she had taught mom and grandma, when I say many years. So a little investigation. Turns out mom had several children, could not always do laundry. The little boy wore a uniform quite often that was dirty. What do children do? They pick on each other. He got frustrated. He physically responded. So what this woman did through her network, because like I said, she'd been there for a while, she got more uniforms for this boy so that he could wear clean uniforms to school. He stopped fighting. It had nothing to do with our lovely give stars, take stars away kind of concept. So I think those kinds of things, by all means, you should be doing, but I don't necessarily think it is the role of a black male teacher to attempt to mentor and be a stand-in father for every child in that school, black boy or black girl or any ethnicity of child.
What's the importance of mentorship, especially when it comes to
mentorship?
Black
Is critical.
Yeah.
And I think there are different things that we learn from different people, in so much that one of the easiest ways, and I'm being somewhat facetious when I call it easy, how about you start some club that is primarily focused on helping young black boys in particular to, you know, kind of figure out who they are. And maybe there's a similar teacher in the building who's interested in doing something for the females in the building. I said earlier, I don't know if any of you caught it, that I did go to an all-girls school, 7th through 12th grade. So I actually am a proponent of single-sex experiences. I think that they are ways in which, as co-eds, we do interact and integrate in all those things, because it's important to learn how to get along, so to speak. But I do think there are things that are easier to do when you are all kind of gender specific or gender same, if you will. So I think there are ways to kind of do that, and it's a bigger relationship than just the teacher and all the students. And then you can also bring in your additional network of other people who can support and share and kind of guide. But mentorship is critical. And if you are involved in any mentoring yourself or looking to be a mentor and a black male, I think you will find that almost every program wants you, because there are not enough who tend to do it in the formalized sense. So there's a critical need for doing it. But I don't know if a teacher takes all that on the top of his own responsibilities as a teacher.
Another question from Facebook Live. Finding out who is important in the child's life. From whom do you get this information from, especially when the child is young, considering some biased perspectives of some parents?
Yeah. Well, first and foremost, you talk to the primary parent. Who's bringing the child to school and picking the child up, especially in the case of children who are young. Most early childhood and elementary curriculums usually have some family type of unit where children need to kind of talk about who's in their family, so to speak, and or their community. So if you're doing that kind of curriculum work, it might come up there. But again, I honestly think it's a conversation, like I said earlier. So if I'm mom and I'm picking up the child, you know, we're getting ready to do so-and-so and such and such. Is there some man in Brandon's life who he might want to invite to come to the classroom that day? It could be your significant other, an older brother, an uncle. Just kind of start there, because if I don't know you, I'm probably not going to tell you all my business and kind of the hows and the whys. But there are ways that you can ask that question to begin that conversation and to get the ball rolling.
Very cool. I think we have about 6 or 7 more minutes left. Anyone else in the audience, face-to-face audience, do you have a question for Dr. Abel? And if not, I can take. Oh, please. Where's that mic? The
I
mic
think
ran
we're going to
away.
start in the back with her and work her way out.
Perfect.
Thank you. I too work in an all-girls school, and the challenge is always making sure that the young ladies feel like they do have a male presence in their life. One issue that comes up sometimes for me is where fathers have had issues in the past, and they haven't been able to go through the Baltimore City, piece.
That whole volunteer with fingerprint?
Yes, exactly. And I don't want to discourage them because, most of them have made changes within their life and they want to help and volunteer, but I'm kind of faced with that roadblock.
Yeah.
So I just didn't know if you have any suggestions as to how I can still maybe engage them so that they feel like they're part of the school culture and their daughter's experience.
Good question.
You might need to more broadly define school culture. So some of that is what can they do at home that's connected back to the learning and the activity. What is around your school community? Meaning, is there a rec center, a faith-based institution, some community center where some other activity might go on that it is easier for a parent to come into? And it could be their event as opposed to a school event. And you could also be present so they get to see you and know you and talk to you, but they're not quote unquote on school property, if you will. And then depending upon what their issue is, because we've been making changes in laws around, if you had a felony and the length of time and that, again, kind of going back to community connections, is there some community organization that might help them, quote unquote, clear their record up? The Men's Center over on the east side is having a series of expungement workshops and things. So technically out of your control, but kind of as you get to know more about Baltimore City and kind of, what's going on and the resources available. And then if you know this information, because you may not, between mom and dad and what their relationship is, how might you navigate how they work together to support each other and spend time? So like I said, it might not end up being in the school building because schools have rules for a reason. But again, it's kind of that presence and that support. So if they can at least talk about that they're reading this book or working on this math skill, it can still make that connection and feel like I know what's going on in school, though I'm not physically in the building.
Thanks so much. I'm going to pass the mic, and while the passing of the mic happens, what do you say to a teacher who says, I can't do another thing? I got lesson plans, I'm trying to manage these students, I got IEP folders, I have 1,000 things to do every single day. What do you say to that teacher?
Well, at some point, you're probably reaching out to parents anyway, because it's kind of part and parcel of the job, and where do you go? Again, kind of going back to my PQP, praise, question, polish. And the polish is usually like a suggestion, improvement, some kind of idea. Who's on your team and how might you strategically use some of your planning time to reach out to parents? The world is quite a different place from when I was a classroom teacher. There are apps that can help facilitate, that conversation and that reach out. If you're using an online grade portal and distribution, note home, just a quick, acknowledgement that they exist. And the goal is, again, to be manageable. So if you have a class of 40 students, do you say, I'm going to call all 40 students' parents tonight? No.
Yes, every single day. Where's those teachers every single day? No.
But could you potentially call 5 in a week? Probably.
Yeah.
And if you do 5 the next week, the week after that,
Yeah.
within a month. For those of you who might be secondary and might have a couple of 100 students, maybe it takes you an entire quarter to reach out. So I think the goal is kind of being reasonable.
That's good.
Yeah.
That's real good. Your question.
Yeah, so I'm not sure if this is more of a myth, but I think a lot of times males have had poor experiences in education themselves.
Yes.
So then when they come to dealing with their children in these environments, they have these walls built up, and a lot of times they don't trust educators. So as an educator that wants to build that relationship, how do we break down those walls to develop trust with these parents, these fathers?
You probably need to start with something innocuous, and again, kind of that gender stereotype. So is there something I can come in and quote unquote build and do around cleanup, birdhouses, bookshelves, whatever, because I might already have that skill set and I do well at it. And then in the context of the conversation, how are you making those connections? And then kind of what's the hook? Many, many, many years ago, I volunteered for Baltimore Reads, which no longer exists. And I had a 19-year-old who was reading on a first grade level. And so that's a challenge. But he had younger siblings. So when I brought in the quote-unquote baby books, we talked about learning to read them so he could go home and read to his siblings. So it wasn't necessarily about him anymore, but a way that he could give and help. So kind of what are the more fun ways? Again, I taught second grade. One of my favorite things were compound word bones, how you stick words together, kind of almost like a game. So it still has some quote unquote curriculum connection. It still has some content, but it's not necessarily me needing to quote unquote be able to read or read well. So kind of what are those ways that learning can still be fun, but is not necessarily the brick and mortar, if you will, of the tradition.
I want to take one or two more questions if I have time from Facebook Live. So one question reads as such. Some fathers are incarcerated. Yes. It's almost to what your point was. Some fathers are incarcerated. What is your vision for a program that could foster paternal involvement during the parents' incarceration? Have any thoughts about that?
Yeah, that gets real complicated. Personally speaking, so this is a personal response, not necessarily one steeped in the education. I'm not 100% certain that I want the child to go into the penal system and see the father in that circumstance. Phone calls, writing letters, things of that nature. So I can't say that I have given that real thought.
I
don't know.
That they see the dad and want to be where the...
Well, not so much that they want to see, but I think there's something about that image, if you will, and that's not necessarily the image I want the child to have of his or her father. I mean, that, like I said, depends on the age of the child, whether or not the father was incarcerated, you know, before the child was even born, because sometimes that happens, or if it happened later on in life. So off the top of my head, I do not know of any programs that do it while dad is still incarcerated, but I am aware of some that kind of work on that whole reentry mode and ways that we can make connections. And I do not work for NFI, because I'm going to plug them yet again. One of the things I like about them is they have materials for when dad is incarcerated, for when dad is deployed, after divorce. I mean, they really do try and cover the gamut of ways that you can connect and interact. The other reason why I think that would get very complicated, especially from the school point of view, is depending on how mom feels about that incarceration and the messaging, who would get the child to the facility and back. So I don't know if I would say schools should go into that realm, but NFI does have some materials that could at least help start the conversation and maybe get people thinking about the how and why it could work.
Now, last but not least, if there's a dad, father of color, dad of color, watching tonight on Facebook Live or anywhere under the sound of my voice, what are some key takeaways after tonight's discussion that you'd like to give them?
A, that you matter, that your involvement and your overall investment, I don't just mean money when I use the word investment, in your child's life can and will make a difference, that you two are human, and while you and the mother of your children may not be together, it still is about that child. So what are ways that the two of you can learn to work together in so much that you are in support of your child? Whether or not you go on to have another relationship, she goes on to have another relationship, y'all are still the parents of this child. How do you help to support him or her to grow up to be the best person that they can be? And I think if you keep that in mind, you will find ways to make it work. Will you get angry? Will you get frustrated? Yes. Do you need to have really good friends? And I know men talk to men differently. That you can share with, get your frustrations out of. Know your own legal rights. You do have rights as dad. Like I said, you count. You matter. But bottom line, do what is in the best interest of your child. He or she will remember it for life, and it will make the world of difference.
I love that. Well, on that note, that's it, right? Can we please give Dr. Yolanda Abel a big round of applause for her participation? I really appreciate you being here. Of course, special thanks to Urban Teachers, my job, and Terra Cafe for hosting and having this event. Thank you all so much for coming. Have a great night. And stay tuned for the next speaker series piece. I believe Melanie Bell, who's huge on restorative justice, restorative practice, that's coming up, one of my good dear friends. So I'm really excited to have that conversation sooner than later. Have a good night, everybody.
Before you walk out, I really do have those resource sheets.
Oh, yes, we have
I'm
resources.
just not 100% certain where they are because they made it to the back. So maybe someone in the back has them. We'll hand them as you go through. But it is a plethora of websites Both active organizations that are doing things with fathers, such as All Pro Dads, Watchdog Dads, all kinds of things, as well as things from the Clearinghouse National Literacy,
nice.
because a large part, again, is just that interaction, that talking. Even if you are talking about the book, because you can't, quote unquote, read the words in the books, that's how you stimulate conversation, critical thinking. So there's lots of things on that lovely little list. So hopefully you really will get one before you leave here tonight. And thank you for coming, and thank you for listening on Facebook Live.
Thanks again. Have a good night. Thank you.